All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of the ICN2 Stay-at-Home Seminar Series. Let's talk about science communication. My name is Justin Sperling, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Advanced Electronic Medical Devices Group under ICREA Professor Jose Garrido here at the ICN2. Given my background in communications, marketing, and content development, it is my pleasure to moderate this event with support from Human Resources and the Marketing and Communications Department as part of the ICN2 Training Plan. So when we as scientists think of scientific communication, we typically think about talks and poster presentations at conferences, or in the case of today's sort of events, webinars, talks on a specific scientific topic. But science communication is much more than that. Communication is changing, and the opportunities and formats that we have to use are growing. Researchers and institutions need to find the most suitable channels for their message. At the ICN2, outreach, together with technology transfer and research, are our core activities, and the communications department is a great resource to support our research through communication. So in that light, I have brought two experts on that topic, Dr. Brynley Pearlstone and Sarah Cosgriff, to share their expertise on scientific communication and engaging with the public. So I'll allow them to introduce themselves now. Sarah and Brynley.
Hello there, my name's Sarah Cosgriff and I'm a freelance science communicator based in the UK, and I also work for the Institute of Physics. So my role at the Institute of Physics involves improving the number of girls taking A-level physics in secondary school. And in my freelance, I present shows, I deliver training to scientists like yourselves, but also to science communicators. I am a biologist by training, and occasionally on the side, I do a bit of stand-up comedy.
Hi everyone, I'm Brynley Pearlstone. I'm a triple threat and the host of SciCurious podcast, which is my flagship podcast project, which I do twice every month. I'm the proud father of several green plant babies, which you can see on the shelf behind me. And my background is in astrophysics. I was involved with the LIGO team and with the discovery of gravitational waves back in 2015. That's my academic background.
So today's format will be different than the usual webinars that we've had here at the ICN2. I want to use this as a panel-based format. So as we go, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section of Zoom. So that should be at the bottom next to chat and participants. I will then present them to the panelists between each section of the presentation. So first, we're going to go through, this is an outline today, and Bryn and Sarah, will you please start us off with why we do scientific communication?
So to my mind, science communication is a practice of making science digestible, relatable, and accessible to the people that you're talking to. It's all well and good telling them all the technical details of everything that you do, but unless it's in a way that they can understand and have a framework for already, they'll not be able to access that information, and it will fly straight through them. So in that sense, science communication is a lot more than just talking clinically about what it is that you do.
Sorry, I was trying to mute myself. So another reason why I think science communication is important is also the image of science. So these pictures that you see in front of you were drawn by children aged 11 to 14 years old. I think we tend to stereotype scientists as being very intelligent, knowing lots of things, but also in terms of how we do science, we tend to see things where science is done in labs with people with lab coats on, and so on. So I think it's really important to break down barriers of actually who is doing science, so look at diversity of science, but also kind of how science is done. It's not always done in labs, in lab coats. Even though, so thinking about the children who drew these pictures, they do have science teachers with science backgrounds, and they are learning about different scientists, and yet this is the stereotype that we see. So I think it is important to consider that as well as part of our science communication. So in terms of what your audience can get out of participating in science engagement, there are quite a few things that they could get involved in. So careers knowledge, so thinking about young people in particular, they might be able to see a diversity of different science-related careers that they can go on to that they may not know about while they're in school. It could also help people make informed decisions. So whether that's how they vote or thinking about different policies that the government introduces, but also things like behavior. So thinking about the time we're in at the moment, there's a current discussion about masks and whether we should be wearing masks so they can make informed decisions based on evidence. It could also be linked to their personal interests. So they may already be interested in science or any related topics of science. So they might be very interested in climate change and environmental science. And that brings it on to current affairs. So you do have current affairs like climate change, like COVID-19, which your science could be linked to. We focus a lot on what the audience can get out of it, but I think it's really important to recognize that it's important for you to get something out of it too. So science communication allows you to develop a whole range of different useful skills. So improving your communication skills. It's also a really good way to be creative, something different to what you might do every day. It could also help inform your research. To give a real life example of that, I know some researchers who were treating water with E. coli and they were asking the public, would you drink this water? And would you water your plants with it? And the public did like the idea of watering the plants with it, but they wouldn't drink the water. So it really helped them thinking about industry applications. And finally, science communication is fun. That's why I do it. I know a lot of researchers that do science communication because it is really fun. It's just, as I said, something really different. And yeah, just something to kind of change up your week. So I think it's really important, just as a final message, of the why you do science communication. I think sometimes we might have a focus on we're giving something to an audience, but it's really important that actually you're giving something to your audience, but also giving something for yourself.
So everybody's going to have a subset of these reasons why to do science communication that will really resonate with them. Perhaps you have a target audience in mind that you'd like to reach. Maybe something in current affairs, such as the coronavirus pandemic, is burning in your mind and you feel that there should be more information out there. Having this motivation clear in your mind is an important first step into practicing science communication. It's a very simple question to ask, but sometimes it can be really difficult to answer. But to my mind, it's part of the most important question to answer. Once you've got that clear answer, it will guide you and help you to develop the thing that you want to do, whether it's a speaking gig or an online engagement project. Having a clear idea of what you or your audience or even some institution will get out of it is going to help to develop what it is that you're going to do.
So our first question on the why is, my research is very niche and not necessarily applicable to everyone. Why is science communication important for my work?
So I'll take that one. Even if your research is, to your mind, niche, the amount of spin-off that any topic can have or is sort of immeasurable. And the way that you approach a research topic or the light that you bring to the way you communicate it can spark off tangential ideas in the people that you're talking to. It might open up a new field for them. It might, the process that you go through when doing your research might illuminate something they can bring to their everyday life. Just because you have a niche research doesn't mean that the way you go about it is irrelevant.
Another question that we have is, what is the difference between divulgate and communicate? Why should we communicate and not divulgate?
Sorry, I was wondering if I can add something to the last question.
Okay, go on. We'll come back to the other one.
Yeah. What was I going to say? So I think it's really important to also, we'll be going into this in the next section about audience, that there are different types of audience. So in terms of what you may not feel relevant is to one audience, it actually might be really relevant to other audiences. And I'm hoping that maybe after the next section, that might help a little bit with thinking, so to kind of answer your question a little bit.
All right, and then back to that question, the difference between divulgating and communicating. Why should we communicate and not divulgate?
So to me, this boils down to that very first slide we had about the three facets of science communication, making a topic digestible, accessible, and relatable. If you just pop some information out there on the web and leave it there in technical speak, the people who are already in the know about this are going to read that and be able to digest it. Unless you do the work of chewing it up and making it into words that your audience could understand, or putting it into a framework and a context that's more easily accessible, it's not really going to hit home for a lot of people. Just popping information out there isn't always the best way to do it. A lot of the time you have to do the work of processing it and making it relatable. And that, to me, is what the communication is all about.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think when you see the next two sections, you'll see a little bit more about what Brynley means by that, in why we need to think about that. So yeah, I think that's a really great answer.
Great. So once we know why we are going to engage in science communication, the next step that we need to do, as you both have said, is consider our audience. So there are two general approaches to figuring out your audience that Sarah and Brynley have shared with me, and they consider those to be the top-down approach, so that's finding an audience that already exists, and the bottom-up approach, where you build your own audience. So could you guys kind of explain those two methodologies and when you should use them?
So when we talk about the general public, this might be what you might visualize as, oh, it's everybody out there, whether that's pretty much anybody outside a scientific conference. But the reality is that within the public, there are many publics. And this could be looking at things like different demographics, so age, maybe occupation. It could also just be their personal interests, so things like sports, or maybe they're interested in the arts. And maybe there's certain groups that will participate in science already. And maybe there are some people who won't participate in science already. So I think that trying to have something as a kind of one size fits all just won't work. Just to give an example from myself, I'm somebody who has pretty much my whole life identified as someone who likes science and does science things. I don't really like going to art galleries. So if there's an art gallery down the road from where I live that is free and I can go into at any time, I'm not really going to go there because I don't identify as that. So it needs to be something that is relatable to me. So let's say we choose one of these publics out of many different publics. And it's important to ask some questions to help us understand that audience. So what is the norm for them? So what is it that they normally do? Do they go to events? Do they have group meetings? What is it they do in their own group? This could also look at things like if they are online, for example, where do they tend to go online? Is it somewhere that's like a social media channel or somewhere completely different? The second question is, do they have any specific needs? What is it that they are needing to get from participating in, let's say, a particular thing that they're doing? So whether that's they go to a class in order to get new skills, and that's why they go there and they need those skills. The third thing is, why should they engage with you? As I mentioned with the art museum, I don't really have enough of a reason to walk through the door. So I need something, a reason for me to go through. And finally, what is their expertise? I think we have to be a bit careful that we aren't just the experts and we're telling non-expert expertise, when in reality, everybody has their own expertise. They have a base level of knowledge they could work from. My father-in-law is a carpenter, and he actually has so much physics within what he does. It's just that he doesn't normally use the language of physics. So I want to learn from his expertise from being a carpenter. And I kind of go, hey, well, actually, do you know there's actually friction within this thing? So it's really important to recognize when different groups have different expertise.
Of course, if you can't select a public that already exists, there's no reason that you can't just build your own. Like Sarah says, there is no general public and there is no general audience. So whatever you do in order to communicate your science, you'll have to target a smaller group. And this can be, if you think of every person as having a set of tags associated with them, perhaps you just collect those tags and build up a picture of the group that you want to target off of those basic tags. As an example, this year is an important anniversary for the Apollo 13 flight. So perhaps you want to do a communication project based on space travel. So You might look at people who are enthusiasts on space exploration, moon landings, even history buffs in the 60s and 70s. And by exploiting these tags, you can build up a wider audience. Now, inherent in this is the acknowledgement that every project that you start is going to have a built-in audience. The example that I just gave, the moon landings, those are the three, off the top of my head, tags about moon landing science. But of course, you can always bring in more than just the built-in audience. If you look wider afield and slightly broaden the scope of your project, perhaps you can bring in political buffs from the 60s and 70s and bring them into the fold as well and teach them a bit of the science that you want to do. And when you do this, you really do have to acknowledge that every audience that you're going to meet is going to be a little bit different. What works for you and your colleagues isn't really going to work for everyone. So the technical language that you use at work isn't going to cut it on the floor of a museum. Think about your neighbor. How would you communicate with your neighbor? What words would you use when you're talking about your work? Now think of the person who's the exact opposite of your neighbor. Would you talk to them in the same way? How would you change your language when you're talking with them? Once you've built up your tags and thought about what would work for your audience, you might find that your preconception of what you were going to do is going to have to change slightly, whether that's the format that you're going to engage in, the scope and depth of the science you're going to talk about, and even the level at which you pitch it. And the way that you address your audience, it's really well defined when you're considering a small cluster of groups. If you're thinking about the space science example again, there's a certain set of language and assumed assumptions that go into that. You can assume they're going to know about rocketry or the lunar atmosphere. But the second you broaden that to involve perhaps those political buffs, you can't make those base assumptions anymore, and you have to start at a different base point.
It's really important to consider language as part of this. So an example I'm giving here is the word abstract. Now, in the scientific community, we use the word abstract to describe a summary at the start of a paper. However, within the non-science community, abstract tends to mean something that is vague. So it's really important to consider language that is everyday to you and your colleagues at work, and that may not be everyday language to somebody who doesn't work in different science fields. I mean, think about when you work with anybody outside of your own field and how different your language is to somebody else. So one of the things I found when I started science communication is when I started using plain old English and non-scientific language, I felt unprofessional. I felt that, well, I don't feel very professional not using these words. In reality, I was actually being more professional because it meant that somebody was more likely to access the information I was giving them. And that's really, really important. So it's important to consider language as part of your science communication for this reason.
And that builds into a broader point. You can put information out there and you can have a project, but unless you really reach your audience and connect with them, then you're not doing the job of making your science accessible. So when you're considering how to reach your audience, the questions that I ask myself are, what will your audience respond to? And that comes back to Sarah's point about language. Is it right to use technical jargon here? What level of technical language should you use? Even perhaps in terms of what they will respond to, is there a certain kind of content that will work better for them? Will they read an essay? Will they rather look at a collection of GIF images? Where can you find your audience? If you can't find them, how are you going to reach them? If you're trying to look for moon buffs, but you're only posting on your Fortnight server forum, you might not find them there. There's a good chance you won't. But if you go to a Reddit thread about space science and make an important post about some forgotten fact from history, then perhaps you'll attract much more of them. And all this boils down to, unless you really shout about what you're doing, no one's going to know about it. Science communication is about communicating. And until you tell people, you're not communicating. Science should not be a secret. So I encourage you, if you're doing a science communication project, to talk about it often, loudly, and proudly. If you're struggling to isolate an audience, to find your audience, to connect to them in a certain way, have a look around. You're not alone. Science communication is a field that already exists and is happening all over the place and everywhere. And lots of it is really good. Take a critical eye to what other people are doing and look at how they're approaching an audience, why they selected that audience, and the language and the format that they use to reach the audience. Really start thinking about the science communication you see in the world with a critical eye. If you still can't get a good handle of how to reach or find or isolate an audience, then you've got help on hand. The communications department at ICN2 has an excellent reputation of doing this. They can help you to find and reach audiences that you wouldn't have thought of. In fact, they're such a good, I wish I had one of those when I was doing my postgraduate study.
So go on, Sarah. Sorry.
That's okay. I was wondering where this one went. So I think this is a final summary of the audience section. I think it's just very important to remember that as much as the work that you're sharing is really valuable and your time doing that is also really valuable, it's not only about you. It's not only about you and your research. It's about your audience. What are their experiences? Can their experiences relate to your research? What have they got to offer? It's just, as I say, really important to consider the audience as much as possible when you are communicating the science.
So now that you've determined your audience, the next important step is determining the format to present your actual scientific communication. So could you guys go a little bit into that, please?
Absolutely. So I mentioned there are many different publics within the general public and choosing one. So let's go back to that audience that you chose. And remember that one of the questions that I asked is, well, what is the norm for them? So to give you a few examples here, maybe it is a local youth group who deliver outdoor activities for children. So, because that's just what I like to do. Maybe you might have a local workshop for adults that help you fix things at home. So I have one of those local to me. Maybe it's a local eco group, so they're interested in environmental issues, but they're not environmental scientists themselves. Maybe it's some local community group where there's a particular group of people who like to meet and share their culture. Or maybe there's somebody who likes to go to arts events like comedy nights. So these people that I'm mentioning aren't somebody who would go to a science lecture. These are the things that are normal to them. And so you can consider the format based on what you think they normally do.
So when thinking about the format, you're going to have a whole bunch of instincts about what it is that you want to do. You'll probably have some content in mind, and by now you've picked an audience. So based on those, what's your gut tell you? What kind of a format would best meet your motivation? We'll go through a few examples in a bit, but just for now, I want to leave it quite open, because having a creative and open idea of what formats are available will help you pick out what might work best for you. Is your idea feasible? It's all well and good to say, I'm going to put on a TV show and millions will watch it, and I'm going to get these famous scientists involved. But that might not be feasible given your resources. So how can you scale your idea back to a more feasible execution? And at this stage, before you commit to anything, I think it's really important to have a few ideas in mind, play with them a bit, talk with a friend or a colleague, and develop them with a bit of conversation, a bit of back and forth. At this point, you've not committed to anything. So just have an explore the space that you're sitting in. And there's a whole bunch of formats that are available to you. I've nailed it down to 3 formats, which are sort of broad categories. On the left-hand side, we have web content, which a lot of us are using now. In the middle, we've got one-to-one. And traditionally, you might think of this as a poster presentation at a conference, but there's much more. And on the right, you've got one-to-many, which traditionally you might think of as a talk at a conference. But of course, there's much more than that as well. And Sarah's got some examples for you on this next slide.
I do indeed. So there are lots of different formats. As Brynley mentioned, there's nothing wrong with thinking, lots of different creative ideas, but you also need to be realistic. I did want to give you a few examples. So in the bottom left, there's a photo of myself and Brynley doing science stand-up comedy. Now, you might be thinking, whoa, I don't think I could ever do that. I could never be funny. And I thought the same way too, to be completely honest. But the way they facilitate it is that it's a safe environment, and I did receive training. And honestly, I got so much out of it. I very unexpectedly got so much of it in terms of skills. I have become a better trainer and speaker because I've done stand-up comedy, to be truthful. And it is just a really fun thing to do. Just to give you a few examples of other different formats, at the top left, this is involving dance as culture, in Scottish culture, and linking that to the science. So you have people that might go to local community events where there is dance, and this is the way in which science has been put into that. On the top right is a wikathon. So wikathons are basically when people get together to write Wikipedia articles. So they could be on scientific content or about different scientists and improving their diversity. Now, this can be done in groups, or it could be potentially done online if you facilitate it the right way. And the bottom right is hands-on activities. The example I wanted to give here are prisons. So there's a project in Scotland where they visit Scottish prisons and they bring in science activities. What they notice is that the prisons actually offer different learning programs for the prisoners, and then they actually run the activities as part of that. It's the fact that they're adding a different offer to the prisoners and answering their questions. So as you can see here, it's linked. If you go back to audience, it's really thinking about what is a normal thing to do for them and how could you then marry the science to that. So that can therefore mean that there are so many different formats you could try out.
And it's important to consider the question of impact when you're choosing your format. We tend to think of impact as how many people we can reach. But when you're thinking about science communication, you're also thinking about what level of depth can you get into with our audience. So I'm going to take a couple of the examples that Sarah just showed. With the prison example, going in to do workshops in prisons, you're getting a very good depth because you've got a lot of one-on-one time, but it's quite a small audience you're reaching. So that kind of a format is good if you want a very narrow but full-on impact. Alternatively, the science dancing, you don't get a very technical understanding of the science that you're communicating in that, but it's fun and it's engaging and it's for really broad audiences. So you're having a much wider audience with a much shallower depth of knowledge. So choosing your format is also the trade-off between depth versus width. And I think it's important to state here that choose your format creatively. You wouldn't have necessarily thought that science dancing would be a good way to get people interested and excited in science, but you're getting people off guard. People are having fun and they're taking in the knowledge that they're being presented because they're enjoying themselves. Being creative and having a really creative idea for a format, I think, is a really fantastic way to subtly sneak science into people's minds. So don't be afraid of that. When it finally comes to delivering your science communication project, depending on the format, you want to have a couple of things in mind. But to me, the key 4 things are, first of all, you should keep your expectations reasonable. Like I said earlier, you shouldn't expect to have a television show with a whole bunch of famous scientists as your first science communication outing. You should have something a bit more reasonable in mind, but you should absolutely aim past your reasonable expectations. Unless we aim past them, we never grow and we never try exciting new things. And in that spirit, I think it's really important to be bold. Go and ask for things that you don't have. Go and try something that's not been done before. By doing this, you're enhancing your own skills, you're testing your own limits, and you're showing others that things that hadn't thought possible can be done. It's important as well to rely on the expertise of those around you. As I said earlier, everybody's got their own expertise, whether that's the expertise of your audience and having them meet you halfway, or the expertise of your colleagues and people around you on helping to facilitate what it is that you do. Maybe you need more hands to work a stall at a festival, or maybe you want to have some event planning expertise from, say, a communications department. And finally, the last thing to consider is it's really important to be detail-oriented when you're delivering your project. This might be whether or not you're including all the correct pronouns in the application form, or it might be that little detail within a bright colorful banner to attract information. A passing detail for you can really bring more people in because it signals to them that you know what you're talking about and that you're on the same page as them. So it's very important, I think, to be detail-oriented when delivering your project.
So just to summarize this section, I think the first thing I'd say is go to your audience wherever you can. So in examples we gave earlier, it's very much going to places where audiences tend to be, and you can also apply the same thing to online. If there's a way to have the audience have a say, then that's a really good thing. It means that they're building a relationship with you. They build their own relationship with science with you as well. That's really great. To give an example from the prison engagement I mentioned, some of the prisoners asked whether they could learn a bit more about genetics. And the reason is that they were worried that their children would be more likely to go to prison because they were there, and they wanted to ask that question of, well, does that work? Third thing is to make sure it's accessible. So whether that's thinking about making sure there's wheelchair access, thinking about hearing and visually impaired people, thinking about PowerPoint formats. For example, the World Blind Union have some really good guidelines on how to make PowerPoints accessible for visually impaired people and for dyslexic people as well. So there's accessibility from that perspective, but also if you're going to hold an event during the day where a lot of people are at work, that's not really accessible. And finally, you can choose more than one format if you do want to. I'm not saying you absolutely have to. It's when it's suitable, you can choose more than one format. Don't feel like you have to restrict yourself to just one thing. Something I think I should have mentioned in the audience section is that publics can also involve people like policymakers and journalists. So there's going to be a talk tomorrow about it. So those are the other formats you can also consider as well.
Great, thanks guys. A couple of questions we have. So going back to language and how it relates to your audience and your format. So explaining plainly the what and the why may be okay, but explaining the how may be much more complicated in terms of language and level of detail. So do you have any recommendations on how we can do that?
I have some thoughts. Something to consider in how you're communicating is not just the language, but what do you need to actually tell them to know something? Do you need to tell them how? Is it relevant in that moment? So that's one thing to consider kind of within that. Brynley, I don't know if you had anything else.
I was going to make the same point that the how is not necessarily the most important thing. Perhaps the how is important, but very technical. In that case, I'd try and boil it down to its key components. It's not necessary all the time to have all the details involved if you're having a quite general topic. And using metaphors and similes in order to say, it's like doing this, is a very good way to make the science relatable. It might not be quite so accurate, but what you trade in accuracy, you get in a broader understanding of the how.
Excellent. And to add to that, I would say, so when you're giving a presentation, you're giving it to your group, let's say when you're having a team meeting and you're presenting on your research results, you're going to be a little more technical because your group has that level of expertise that you have or close to it. But when you're presenting it, let's say on a web forum for an external group, you may need to skip over the how and give a very, very surface level detail on, so we use this mechanism to sense something, and not go into the detail of it, just explain that this is generally what we do, and then go more in detail on the why, because the why in most cases when it comes to scientific communication to an external group typically tends to be something more so what they're interested in, and not necessarily the how unless they're highly technical. So I think that was a very good point given both by Bryn and Sarah related to that. And just so everybody knows, another reminder, we do have this Q&A section. Anything that you guys put in here, I will either ask in between sections, or if I feel like it's a good question for the end, I'll save it for that. So I'm not ignoring anyone's questions, anyone who submitted them. I'm just saving a couple of them because they're really good for a summary question. So now that we've discussed the why, the audience, and the format, I think it's important to kind of look at the resources that we have available.
So talking about resources, it's a very simple question. What resources are important to your project? And this might be tangible things, but we also shouldn't neglect information as a resource. So the first thing that I think of when I'm starting a project is what already exists. Am I about to enter a very crowded space with a lot of projects doing a very similar thing? How can I distinguish my project from theirs? How can I learn from their project to make my project better? What paperwork is going to be necessary? If I'm doing a project involving talking to school children, perhaps I need to get their parents' permission. Maybe I need some disclaimer paperwork to hand out to participants if I'm taking photographs. What equipment or software do I need in order to run my science communication project? Right now, we all need a computer to do any kind of communication, science or otherwise. That's equipment. Most of us already have that. So it's worth bearing in mind all the things that we take for granted as well. And finally, expertise is, of course, a resource. You're an expert on your own subject. Your audience is an expert on their subject, and everybody involved is going to have their own expertise. How can you use it as a resource and really leverage it to make the most of what it is that you want to do? So when thinking about this, I find it really useful to sort your resources into two broad categories, two buckets. The first of these is in kind, and that means what do you already have? What can you, as a science communicator, bring to the table? That might be a computer, internet access, expertise, your own time, a whole slew of things. And to my mind, it's worth making a very thorough list, because you might find that options are open to you when thinking about what resources are available that you hadn't considered. This might be through a friend or leveraging a family asset. The second bucket is what is budgeted. What is it that you don't have that you absolutely need to get in order to fulfill your project? It might be that you need to buy some hardware or software, or even hire a venue. And this should also be a very thorough list, because anything that you can cut a corner on, cut costs on, you absolutely should. I think that it's not necessarily right that science communication is better just because it's more expensive. You might also find that by slightly adjusting the scope, you can cut out a whole chunk of your budget. So be prepared to make compromises here as well. You might find that your budgeted costs are minimal, below only a handful of euros, in which case it's not really worth considering, and it's just a little bit of pocket money to splash here and there. Anything that becomes something you might bulk at spending of a week, definitely worth thinking about for a second time. Once you've got your assets sorted into these two buckets, and you think that you're going to need some money to help you out to fund your project, it's worth looking for funding. Now, I'd recommend if this is your first science communication project, I start quite modest, anywhere from a couple of hundred to up to maybe 2,000 euros. And that might seem like quite a lot, but you'd be surprised how much it can cost to put on a live event. And when thinking about this, you might think about going to relevant learned bodies. For example, CSIC or INTA in Spain, or even businesses and universities in your area. They often have pots put aside for certain kinds of scientific communication and professional development that you can apply for and pull money from. Now, when it comes to applying for funding, everybody has a different funding process. So it's very much about reading the guidelines that they give you and filling out the form that they send to you. And when doing that, it's definitely worth considering that what you're doing is not necessarily trying to communicate a technical idea here. What you're trying to do is sell your project. They want to give you money, and you want to give them some science communication. So treat it as a sales pitch. Have a hook, have a catchy line, and have, importantly, a very clear idea of what it is that you can do. If you can boil your project down to, say, 100 words or fewer in a really catchy way, it really goes a long way towards selling what it is that you're doing. And you've got people on hand who have a lot of experience in writing this kind of funding application. The communications department at ICN2, I imagine, have a lot of expertise in this. And so I wouldn't be afraid to go and ask them to look over your funding application. Help give it a bit more personality and a bit more pizzazz.
So I did want to go into a bit more detail about experts, and I think it's really important to always ask for help. I do. I still ask for help too. Brynley, I know that you do as well. Even though we're very well and experienced in science communication, and you are surrounded by experts, whether that's people who, like ourselves, are within science communication, whether that's people that you work with who've got a lot of experience, your communications team. Remember that some things are going to be in kind, and sometimes some people you may have to pay for expertise. So something to really consider within your budgets. But it's really important to consider this because maybe you aren't as familiar with the format, maybe you're not as familiar with an audience. And there are probably plenty of people who would be happy to help. However, it is worth making it their time. So make it worth their time even. So for example, if somebody needs to do science communication as part of their role, that immediately makes it worth their time. If let's say you're working with a particular audience and you have somebody who works with them, like a community leader of some sort, maybe you are helping them diversify their program. Maybe they have to, as part of their job, add science to the program. Maybe a school needs to have that as part of their offer for their school. So finding ways in which it benefits both parties, so yourself and the other person, is absolutely ideal, but do really consider getting expertise where you can, because there are plenty of experts out there.
All right, we have a question here. Should science communication be free, or should an entrance fee always be paid?
That is an excellent, excellent question, because there are different audiences that just can't afford to go somewhere. So the Science Museum in London, for example, is free for entry, but science museums around the country tend not to be, and it can be a big barrier. So sometimes museums actually give out tickets for free in order to improve the access for that audience, although it doesn't necessarily take into account things like travel. I think it really depends on your budget, but ideally try to make it free so it improves its accessibility for as many people as possible. I don't know what you think, Brynley.
I think that's an excellent point. I think where you can, make it free, but not all formats favour having a free event or a free science communication. For example, if you're putting on a stage show in a venue, there are a whole bunch of associated costs involved, hiring the space, hiring actors and performers. And so people will expect to pay to come and see a show. If that show just happens to be science, it's sort of part of the package. However, if you're coming to a lecture theatre to have an accessible lecture on science, you might not expect to pay for it. So really think about the format that you're going to have and the audience you're targeting when you're thinking about pricing an event. Always try and make it free or as low cost as you can to attend, but some things will have a price rolled in.
And to add to that, thinking about, so there's one event called Pint of Science, which tends to be held in pubs and bars. It is actually international, so I think there might be one in Spain actually. But what they do is they put a low cost on the ticket. And the reason why they do that is that if something's free, then it's very easy on the day to go, oh, I won't turn up. Whereas if you put a low cost, it's enough of an investment for that person to make them more likely to turn up. You won't get 100% of the people who turn up, but sometimes adding a tiny cost of like a few euros can actually help improve the attendance rate.
All right, and so another question we have is, how can you determine the effectiveness and worth of what you've just done? How can you justify the resources you've used? And then how do you handle a failure on impact after you've been able to look at this and the effectiveness of what you've just done?
Those are three very good questions, and they're all really intertwined. In terms of measuring the effectiveness of your science communication, it's quite difficult to do if you've got quite an open event. But certainly for a closed event, it's not abnormal to have audience or participant feedback forms, or even just having a conversation afterwards to gauge what they got from it. You end up having a slightly unnatural response because people want to say what you want to hear, but it's better than nothing. And that's my first thought. Sarah?
So it really depends what your outcomes are, if that makes sense. I think in terms of determining whether something's worked or not, I think you have to kind of measure it against an outcome. So I'm just trying to think of an example. Imagine if you would like to change a perspective of somebody, let's say related to your area of work. It may not be realistic in, let's say, an hour talk or 30-minute talk, because they may have had that for quite a long time. So I think setting a realistic goal is really important, and something that's also relevant as well. So I think, yeah, I think it really depends on the outcome. If, let's say, you hold an event and nobody turns up, that's also then also a clear, well, that hasn't worked. So I think it's also really important to recognize that stuff does go wrong. As much as we can present all these wonderful projects, there are things that have definitely gone wrong in them. It's just that you may not see it because you might see a more finesse product down the line, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Can you repeat the question about failure for impact, Justin?
Yes, so how do you handle the failure on impact? For example, let's say you organize an event with all of the effort that it takes, with reasonable expectations, but you don't reach as many people, or it doesn't have the minimum effort you expected, or people aren't getting the takeaway that you thought. How do you handle that?
This is a really common thing in science communication, I think, Sarah.
Yes.
I'm right in saying that. People are going to see science and think, I'm not into that, or they're going to come along and then end up getting bored and wandering off. And the only thing that you can do is learn from what you've done. You can take your experience and build on it for next time. Work out what didn't work. Ask people bluntly, how did you think about it? What did you think about it? What could be better? And then if you want to do it again and try and improve, work on those things.
Yeah, and I think it's making sure you ask the right questions as well. So this is where people who do evaluation on really big projects are really useful. But honestly, just learn from your mistakes. The reason why I'm more successful in what I do now is because of making plenty of mistakes before. It just happens. I think you really need to think about your project as much as you can, but in reality, it's not going to run perfectly. There is going to be something that will go wrong. It's just about recognizing it and how do you know what's gone wrong. And yeah, I think what Brynley is saying about making sure you ask your audience, what do you think? What I was saying earlier about having your audience have a say, I think as long as you do as much of the research as you can, you're going to reduce the likelihood of something going wrong, if that makes sense.
I think this comes back to what I was saying earlier in the format section. Keep expectations reasonable. Don't expect to hit it out of the park on your first time. The first time you do something, you don't have the experience and the skill set that's learned from repeated trials, as it were. So keep expectations reasonable and stick at it. Don't expect to hit out of the park first time, but do try and build on what you've done and learn from what you're doing.
I'll give a personal first experience. I remember the first time I presented, it was kind of a science cabaret show that somebody else set up, where they pretty much, you have 8 minutes, you could do whatever you like, but not a scientific talk, just whatever you like. And I did something. I was terrible. I was honestly terrible, but that was back in 2013. I have come a long, long way since. And I think it's really important to just get started with something or get involved with something that already exists. And you could recognize what things do and don't work based on that, but also recognize that you'll make mistakes.
Excellent. Andrea pointed out that Pint of Science happens in more than 60 cities in Spain and is free. So it does happen here as well. And I think I just want to add to what both Sarah and Brynley were saying is that, it's one of those things, scientific communication and any sort of communication, where getting feedback afterwards, even anonymous feedback, always helps you gauge and change what you're doing to make it better the next time. Think about stand-up comics. They have to practice until they're able to engage with their audience and understand what works and what doesn't work. They don't fit their sets. So when you see one of them on a special on prime time or on some sort of recorded big venue sort of event, they've taken the time to actually work through that material and test it out on smaller audiences first before they're presenting it to a large audience and we get the big laughs. So I think now I'd like to ask both Brynley and Sarah to please just walk us through a couple of examples from their own experience on how they went through this process and setting up their own sort of scientific communication. And then after that, we'll turn to the remaining questions that we have. And please, if you think of anything question-wise, please do submit it to the question and answers, and I will organize them for after they go through their examples.
Can I just say that you are asking really excellent questions, so thank you. So this is, the example I'm going to give is from my last job. So what I really liked about my last job is I wasn't working in a science organization. I was working for a youth charity. And this youth charity is called the Prentice Trust. And they work with young people aged 16 to 25 who are not in employment, educational training. And basically they ran different programs where they would actually help upskill them, help them into jobs, maybe get them to go back to college or university as their outcomes. So they weren't really a science organization, but we were looking at how could we put science into what we did. So that's the who. Why were we going to be putting science activities? We could be putting any different types of activities. And the types of activities we had in mind were really engaging activities. And the youth workers who worked with groups, those groups of young people, always liked having new activities to have fun with. They kind of like having almost like a list of different things that they could pull out at any given time. Also raising awareness of different types of jobs that the young people can pursue. So there might be some already interested, or maybe didn't realize they could be interested in different science-related careers, as well as science in everyday life, that actually science is very much present in there. The third thing is skills development. So the main part of the programs is very much skills. So that could help them into jobs, into university, into college, whatever the next step is, and trying to develop those while they're in programs. That was the core thing that the organization did and what the youth workers always had in mind. So there was very much a why already, and science activities were a really good way of getting at skills development. Now let's think about the audience, to the young people we're working with. So this is kind of post-school, and the sort of things that they did while on the programs are sort of craft-based hands-on activities, really engaging hands-on activities. They weren't really learning like you would in school, apart from maybe doing a bit of coursework. They may have also had really bad experiences of learning science at school, whether they found it was for clever people when it's actually, science should be for everybody, but sometimes it can have that perception that it's only for a certain type of person, and they might feel like, I'm not that kind of person, I did really bad, I failed tests, I failed exams. And the third thing is, in their mind, they also saw skills development as something that's really important. So that's what they're thinking about first, skills development, so I can get to my next step. These are things I enjoy, but also these are my potentially personal experiences, although this doesn't reflect all the young people we worked with. And then the format. We saw, right, well, they really enjoy interactive activities. So we then developed some hands-on activities which would help build the skills, was what they were thinking of. This activity would need to be delivered by youth workers. So the youth workers themselves don't come from a science background, and they may not also have all the kit that you may need. So we need to think about, well, what is the equipment they already use, which is craft, art-based activities. They might have some sports equipment, they might have some outdoors equipment, team building activity equipment like rope, and how could we use that so that it's as low cost as possible for them, but also easy for them to deliver. So the format that we chose in the end was very similar to what they used to delivering. And then the resources. So the resources we have are the youth workers. The youth workers were a really powerful resource because they knew the young people really, really well. They also knew different types of young people. They were facing different barriers like homelessness, had a hard time holding down a job for many, many years, some who've maybe never been employed at all. So it was really important to use them. I already mentioned the kit, that they might already have kit that they were already using, and trying to build those into those activities as much as we could. Sorry, I'm trying to read the PowerPoint. The other thing is that there are actually lots of really good ideas online on different science activities. So we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We just took what we found online and just changed it. So we changed the format so that it matched their language and maybe follow the course. They did a lot of outdoor stuff. So one example we did a water filtration activity using like plastic cups and cotton balls, that sort of stuff that you can buy from just a shop down the road. And we thought this would be a really good activity for them to do outside when they're on residential, but also inside the classroom. So it's worth just adapting what's already there, and it saves you a lot of work. And finally, something that would follow the course content. So they had different modules on team building and communication skills. And if we found a way to always link to those modules, it meant they could complete their coursework, they saw the relevance, and yeah, it just fitted really nicely into the program. So hopefully this will give you an idea of my thought process and hopefully a good structure. But I applied the same ideas to a new project that I've started working on recently. And yeah, just making sure that you understand your audience and what's already there, and really going back to why you're doing it really helps provide a framework on what you're doing.
So my example that I'm going to give to you is SciCurious podcast. It's my flagship thing that I do, and it's the science communication that I'm most proud of. It's the podcast that highlights LGBT people in STEM and gets to know the queer side of science. Let's get into it. So the first question I had to ask was why? I wanted to know why I was motivated to do science communication. And this was really personal for me. While I was doing my PhD in astrophysics, I noticed that there was a lack of diversity among scientists who are readily visible. But when I looked around the lab and the department, I saw this really vibrant and diverse set of scientists and wondered why only the most cut and dry ones were being promoted and highlighted. I also know that LGBT people in research have a whole set of different challenges, whether it's choosing where you go to research and which conferences you go to. You might want to avoid places like, for example, Russia or China, or even local politics and how they affect your work and who you can and can't support with your paycheck. And for me, it was really important that I gave back to the format of podcasts. Listening to podcasts got me through my undergraduate and my postgraduate. So I was really motivated to involve podcasting somehow. My audience is sort of built in. This is an example of ground up audience. So I knew that the people who I'd be addressing were going to be podcast listeners. It's very hard to go to the street and say, hey, you, go listen to a podcast. A lot of people just don't know what a podcast is. I knew that the people that I was addressing were going to be science enthusiasts or LGBTQ affairs enthusiasts or both. And so to get through to them, I wanted to use a lot of queer coding in everything that I did. My logo uses the rainbow flag, a lab coat. Even the name is a play on bi-curious, which is an outdated term for exploring sexuality. Throughout the show as well, I allude to a whole bunch of this stuff. The format might seem really cut and dry. It's a podcast. What can you do with that? But in fact, there's a lot out there for podcasts. You've got release schedules. You've got the sort of radio clock. What does each episode entail? How long is it? What's the content? So I had to think of this. And I decided that an interview, a different interview every month, would give me lots of time to work on good content and highlight a lot of people over the course of the podcast's run. I knew that hour-long podcasts for science interviews were a popular format, and there were a lot of long-standing podcasts of that format. So I chose that as well. And I know that a podcast can be listened to anywhere at any time. So it's really up to the listener's convenience as to when they want to listen to me. When it came to resources, I looked to grants. When it came to resources, I looked to grants. My in-kinds, I knew that I had my own expertise and my own experiences. I already had a laptop and an internet connection. And I could rely on colleagues and the LGBT STEM community for interviews. But I was lacking a podcast host and a good microphone. So I got in touch with my local science community group, the Glasgow Science Festival. They pointed me towards a grant that I should apply to and helped me to write it. They gave me feedback on making it pop a little bit more. With that, I was successful in getting the grant and getting everything off the ground. The outcome of that is that it's been more than a year now, and SciCurious is still growing. I had more than 2,500 downloads and over 20 LGBT researchers highlighted over the course of the podcast's run. During this time, I've won 2 further grants to help the podcast keep going. And I've even branched out to have on-the-ground events, not just online. So I've really watched this grow. It's been really fun.
So just to provide a few final thoughts. I think the first one we want to highlight is to be patient. I think that we've both provided really, really great examples, but bearing in mind that has come from some experience, some actual, a lot of thought that goes into it. You know, the example I gave was something I did as a full-time job. So I think it's worth being patient and not always having to think really huge. You can start really, really small and then get bigger from there. You can get involved at any level, whether that's helping volunteer for whoever's running a project, maybe existing programs. Applied to Science is a really good example of that, actually, because that is something that is already organised, and either you can volunteer to help run it, or you could even volunteer to be a speaker. I know from the UK perspective that people will eventually go and actually be part of the organising committees for them as well. So there are different levels you can get to participate in. But make sure that you do think critically about what you're doing. I think in terms of, you know, you will likely make some mistakes, but if you think about the audience really critically and the format and why you're doing it, that can actually help you produce something good and also produce something realistic. Always think about asking for help and who from. Don't feel like you have to do things alone. You can get colleagues involved. You can get other people from different institutions involved. There's nothing wrong with that. As I mentioned, I still ask for help and input from various different people that I know. The reality is that somebody's going to know more than I do about a format or the audience. Yeah, and just make sure that you do have fun. It is really important that you are going to be spending time on this, maybe not all the time in the world, but you could be spending a significant amount of time on it. It is worth making sure you are getting something out of it. Have fun with it. Have fun being really creative with it. Science communication is a really interesting thing to do. And I just hope that you can find a format that you feel really passionate about, and you know, it's about your work at the end of the day that you're passionate about. So yeah, bring that with you. So that is from all from the both of us. Thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to having more of your great questions.
If you've got any more questions we don't address in this as well, or you don't feel comfortable asking in this kind of format, feel free to find us on Twitter or drop into our emails. They're all on screen for you now, so don't be afraid.
Great, thank you guys. Couple of questions. I'm going to narrow it down to 3 and combine a couple of them. So bear with me as I mentally combine them. So there's a series of 3 questions that I think all relate. It's, do you think that there is a gift for public speaking, or is it something that can be trained without a problem? And
let's address that one first before we pile more questions on. I think both can be true. I think you can have a certain amount of sort of disposition and a good voice for public speaking and a good clarity of thought, but it's absolutely a muscle that can be trained and should be trained. Sarah, you mentioned to me something about comedy with this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So to give a presentation example from me, I remember when I was at university, I gave a presentation I got a 3rd. I did very badly in my presentation. And now as a job, I present, what has happened here?
I was asked to stop you guys from sharing the screen, so I've just taken over so we can see everybody.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I was not always a good presenter. I did like talking to people and I felt confident doing it, but in terms of putting it into a decent format and actually being good at presenting, I was never always good at that. So my advice would be practice, but also there are different ways of presenting. So I'm very big and very confident, but there are some people who actually are quite more sort of Softer speaking. There are different types of speakers. Don't feel like you have to be a certain type of speaker to be a good speaker as well. So that would be my initial advice on that, I think.
Yeah, and I can add, having worked with professional speakers in the past, before I did a PhD and got back into science, it really boils down to motivation. If you feel motivated enough, you can do it. Anyone can do it, in terms of being able to present information. And it's a really good thing to practice and important for all of us as either scientific researchers or outside of scientific research, just to be able to communicate and to practice that skill set. It's very good to have. So another question that was asked related to this is, well, then is science communication a team effort or is it only individualistic?
Both.
Yes, both. I would say it's both. Even if you are, well, at the same time, even if you are doing it by yourself, you can still ask for help, if that makes sense, in terms of getting feedback. It doesn't have to be somebody who actually has to give you a hand on the project. It could just be like, what do you think about this idea? So even as individual can still, but yeah, I'd say both. It really depends what you want to do.
And in that sense, oh, sorry, go ahead.
As an example, the podcast I do myself, I interview the guests, I edit the show, and I put it out there. Without a guest to interview, I wouldn't have a show. Without a hosting service, I wouldn't have a show. Often I do on-the-ground events, and that's very much teamwork. I rely on guests to come along and look after themselves. I rely on the venue to be orderly, and I rely on my hosts that I'm going to go and join there with to work with me as well. It's got to be both.
Yeah, and I will write shows and present shows myself. I bring the kit in, I set up by myself. Although no, the venues are usually quite good at helping me with that too. But it can be really, for me personally, I wouldn't say this is a general thing. For me personally, I sometimes find it hard to write shows by myself because I'm like, is this any good? I don't know. So often I will go to peers and say, what do you think about this? Does this work? There's this bit I'm a bit stuck on. So even though they're not in the final part of the final outcome, it's just still really nice to do that. But that's the way I personally work.
And with that being said, to follow up on that, so how do we motivate people who may be hesitant to participate as volunteers in activities like school visits, science fairs, some sort of communication engagement at every level? How do we motivate people to then do that?
That's an excellent question. I think that it's worth everybody considering to doing science communication, but at the same time, I don't think everybody should do it. Because if you are not motivated enough, it just won't be good, if that makes sense. It just won't be, the audience will know that they don't necessarily really want to be there. So I think it's really important that you don't force anybody into it, but there's nothing wrong with getting them to consider it and something that's familiar to them.
I completely agree. Everyone should give it some thought. Like it was said earlier, if people want to get involved, it has to be worth their time. And that means a different thing to everybody, whether that's to do with career progression or cash payment for taking part. You'll have to get people involved and interested in different ways.
Excellent. And just jumping back to format and with everything going on today, so how do you think the coronavirus crisis influences the way that we communicate as scientists or in general for communication, and how can we still engage with audiences in that way?
I've got a really interesting thought on this. I think it's interesting, but I'm allowed to. So I don't think that what's going on now has changed a lot of the format. A lot of what we did before can still be done. I've gone to online drag shows and performances during coronavirus. They still exist. You can still pay entry and have a drink and sit down and watch your favorite performers. And I've been to lectures and talks and seminars like this. What's changed a lot is the audience and how you reach them. Now you're talking about tech-savvy people and people who have to go and seek this out. You're not going to be walking to the shops and hear about this on the way. Friends might not chat about it at a party. And so reaching your audience, I think, is the much harder thing than deciding a format.
I think I have to agree with that. But I think the current situation does present very interesting things for science communication because of things like the amount of misinformation, what people are actually doing now in terms of behaviors. They're spending a lot of time online now. And yeah, I think it presents different challenges now, I think. But yeah, I agree. The formats would be the same, just accessing differently. And it makes you wonder if, because I think there are certain things that are going to be more accessible because people are able to access things online, but also maybe the opposite, where because the internet is not always accessible, it depends on how many devices are in their homes, I think then it also provides barriers. Yeah.
So as an example, there's been a lot of talk. There's a program called STEM Ambassadors, where researchers will go into schools and talk with school-aged children about going into a career in science. Now, schools aren't really in session anymore at the moment in the UK. I think it's the same in Spain as well. And so there's been a lot of talk about how do we engage kids online and how do we help facilitate kids online. And some of that conversation spiraled out as well as to how can we facilitate the parents so that they can better help the kids? How can we train the teachers so that they're better equipped to deal with this online environment? So the same conversation spirals out into a different audience for the same problem.
Good. And then our final question that we have is, how can I use social media as a tool to engage in scientific communication?
Social media is a tool. It's not its own platform necessarily, but it is a very good tool for reaching out. When I think of social media, I first of all go to Twitter. Now, there's a good science communication community on Twitter, and there's a lot to be learned from there. I think picking up on other people's expertise and thinking critically about what they tweet, who they tweet to, why they tweet what they tweet, is a really interesting way to learn about how to use science communication on social media for your own ends. It's a very general question with a very difficult answer. As with a lot of general questions, it really depends on your specifics. Who is your audience? Why do you want to do science communication? You know, all these questions that we've gone through. Think critically about them.
So to provide another perspective, I think sometimes, so I see quite a few scientists who will use social media like Twitter, some will use Instagram, and sometimes it might be a way maybe not to necessarily get the outcome of somebody will learn something about this. It can be also a way to practice your science communication. It's how many characters is it on Twitter? Is it 280? 280 characters to describe your research. That is a challenge. So it might be worth considering how you could use social media in that way. I also know so thinking about families and communities perspective, there are science communicators in the UK who do try to work with families. And one of the best ways they do that is through Facebook, because that's what a lot of parents do. They go on Facebook. So there are ways, so I have a local community group who have been actually sending messages to each other of, could somebody pick up some shopping for me? Somebody could do this. And I responded to one saying, I've got a load of science equipment. Do you want it? And I could just drive over to your house and drop it off so your kids have something to do. So that's a couple other things to think about. The other thing is that I know that myself and Brynley know Sam Langford is doing a science quiz every Monday, and the way he shares it is through Twitter. So it's not just about necessarily sharing things through words, but, oh, I'm doing this thing. Does anybody want to participate? YouTube is also another thing. I know of somebody called Marty Jobson who is doing some stuff around microscopy, and he'll do that live on YouTube. So it might be worth going to watch them and see what they do and take some inspiration. And there's also the science from home videos. There's a hashtag science from home. That could be also a good source of inspiration, but also you could try and do it yourself. So I'm probably going to film a new one this week, something 3 minutes long, that would just involve me just talking a bit about science and just trying that out for myself. So yeah, so there's different ways you can do it, but also maybe use it as a way to practice your science communication.
I'd also like to highlight social media is a series of social networks, and those networks are a fantastic thing to leverage. Sarah mentioned Facebook and jump onto Facebook communities. If you can find your audience reflected in these communities, your target audience, they're already built in. They're going to see it there, and you might point them towards something you're doing elsewhere on the internet or even in the real world. Think of it as a message board or a signpost, and you're looking for those networks.
Great. All right, guys, thanks. So I've put up here again for everyone to see ways to reach out to both Sarah and Brynley. should you have any questions further for them. We've actually run out of time. I'd like to thank you both for your time and for coming here and giving us such a great talk. And while I have everybody, I wanted to remind you all that we have our second event for making research visible to the media tomorrow at 12 noon. So for those of you interested, you can sign up. It'll be a great event where we actually get to meet with a freelance journalist related to scientific communication. So thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Justin.
Thanks, everyone.